The truth about quantum mechanics and the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Anticipated objections. Now I will refute the most common objections to my theory of fundamental consciousness and the new interpretation of quantum mechanics that follows from it. Objection 1. But there is no evidence for this basic consciousness you're postulating. The key to the refutation of this objection is the law of privacy, one of the 6 laws of consciousness of our universe. This law states that subjective conscious experience is private to the entity experiencing it. You can observe a person's brain on any scale you want, but you will only ever see its objective physical structure, grey matter, or groups of neurons, etc. You will never be able to directly observe their subjective conscious experience. Direct observation of any subjective conscious experience apart from your own is impossible in the same way that it is impossible for anything to travel faster than the speed of light. Modern scientists might want a conventional, objective analysis of consciousness, but they will never be able to achieve this because consciousness is a purely subjective phenomenon. And we have to remember that as philosophers and scientists, we don't get to tell the universe how to be. She dictates her laws to us and not the other way round. The law of privacy has been implicitly acknowledged in philosophy for centuries, where it is referred to as solipsism. Solipsism is the acknowledgement of the fact that the only consciousness you can be absolutely sure exists is your own, since direct objective observation of consciousness is impossible. There are a number of famous philosophical thought experiments that prove this. For example, maybe you are a brain in a jar, or a brain in a matrix, and the world around you, including all the people you encounter, are illusions or programs that have no existence except in your mind. There is no way for you to objectively prove beyond doubt that this isn't the case. But of course, on an everyday, subjective basis, you believe that the people and animals, etc., around you are conscious. Why? Well, because you are a conscious being, so you intuitively know what it is to be conscious. So when you observe similar formations of conscious energy like other humans, you intuitively recognize their behavior to be the result of their similar consciousness. Since consciousness is a purely subjective phenomenon, it can't be understood from a purely objective perspective. All knowledge about something purely subjective, including whether it exists or not, can only be subjective. The more similar the construction of conscious energy is to an observer, the more likely is its behavior to be recognized as conscious. Thus, humans immediately recognize one another as conscious. It has taken longer to recognize plant consciousness, for example, but thanks to sensitive and careful observation, we now know plants are conscious. And on reflection, it's obvious a flower, for example, is conscious of sunlight and enjoys it and strives to be in it as much as possible, a conscious behavior we call phototropism. Now, since things like electrons are so basic and thus possess correspondingly basic sets of conscious perceptions and abilities, their behavior from a human perspective is so simple and predictable it isn't immediately recognized as conscious behavior. But of course they are conscious, because you are made out of nothing but just such particles and you're conscious. Finally, if you object to my theory on the grounds that there is no direct objective evidence of this consciousness, you are also logically forced to deny the existence of any consciousness and to even deny that your family and friends are conscious, for there exists no direct objective evidence for any consciousness at all. And you are also forced to deny the conventional probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics, since there is equally zero direct evidence for quantum mechanical probabilism. That is, there is no observed physical basis for the probabilistic collapse of the wave function. It is simply inferred from the results of quantum experiments. Similarly, my theory of fundamental consciousness is also inferred from the experimental results of quantum mechanics. And if we confine our attention to just quantum mechanics, both interpretations are logical and possible. And the only way to decide between them is with reference to our experience of the universe outside the realm of quantum mechanics. And within the context of our total experience and understanding of the universe, my theory is obviously the correct one. All the physicists that created quantum mechanics admitted they didn't understand how to interpret it, whereas my interpretation is simple, logical, and intuitive. Also, under the conventional interpretation, there is no possible solution to the hard problem of consciousness. There is no possible answer to the question, how do basic, non-conscious, probabilistic particles come together to generate our conscious experience? Whereas my theory immediately solves the hard problem of consciousness. You are conscious because all the energy and particles you are formed out of are themselves individually conscious. And these individual conscious entities can bond together to form more complex conscious entities, from particles to atoms to molecules to cells to you. This explains why you can put your conscious attention into any part of your body and consciously sense it. This is the communication of the consciousness of your foot, for example, to your centralized conscious self. If the particles making up your foot weren't conscious, you wouldn't be able to have conscious sensation of them. I will go into greater detail as to the nature of human consciousness in a dedicated essay to follow. Note on the law of privacy and the Turing test. The law of privacy has already been implicitly acknowledged by the modern scientific establishment in the Turing test. In the Turing test, a particular AI is considered to possess genuine intelligence if it can carry out a conversation with a human that convinces the human that they are talking to a genuine intelligence. Thus, the Turing test is a purely subjective judgment. And of course it has to be, because intelligence is a function of consciousness, and consciousness can only ever be recognized subjectively. Okay. Anticipated objection 2. Show me the maths. People are accustomed to the presentation of new physics involving some new mathematical formalism. This is not the case with my theory. All the mathematics describing my theory was developed decades ago, and none of it needs to be changed or modified whatsoever. I am simply providing the correct metaphysical interpretation of quantum mechanical experiments. It is important to remember that physicists use mathematics to describe and predict physical reality. That is, to describe and specify the geometry and dynamics, the positions and momenta of the various components of a given system, as well as the physical results of various experimental measurements on the system. I do not deny or contradict any of the experimental results of quantum mechanics. In fact, the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics makes some of the most accurate experimental predictions of any branch of physics. I have just provided the correct explanation of the intrinsic nature of the energy and particles that produce the observed experimental results. A logical explanation that the founding fathers of quantum mechanics openly admitted was lacking. Again, there is a strong analogy to the Copernican revolution. Copernicus didn't deny or contradict any of the experimental observations of the motions of the sun and the planets. The experimental observations were all good. He simply provided the correct interpretation of the observations by changing the fundamental postulate of the solar system from geocentrism to heliocentrism. And following in his footsteps, I have provided the correct fundamental postulate of consciousness for our universe that allows for an interpretation of quantum mechanics that is both logical and intuitive. With respect to Copernicus, it is interesting to note that if we confine our attention to just the motions of the solar system, then the geocentric theory of the solar system could still be maintained, since it can be proven using Fourier analysis that the motions of the solar system can be described to any accuracy we want, even with the Earth assumed to be at the center of the solar system, simply by adding more epicycles. It is only in the larger context of Newtonian physics that geocentrism becomes obviously wrong, since the epicyclical motions of the geocentric theory are inconsistent with Newton's law of conservation of momentum, as well as his central law of gravity. Similarly, if we confine our attention to just quantum mechanics, then intrinsic probabilism is just as reasonable an explanation of quantum mechanics as is my theory of fundamental consciousness. However, in the broader context of the whole of physics, as well as our experience as conscious beings, my theory becomes immediately obvious as the correct one, since we are conscious beings who spend all our lives making conscious choices, and we are constructed out of nothing but quantum entities like protons, neutrons, and electrons. And if none of these entities possessed any consciousness, neither would we. Finally, the fact that the experiments of quantum mechanics forced physicists to resort to probabilistic maths is strong evidence in favor of my theory, since as we know from our studies of conscious human and animal behavior, such as psychology and economics, conscious behavior can only be described using probabilistic maths, and not with deterministic maths. This is because one of the defining characteristics of the consciousness of our universe is limited free will. And obviously, free will isn't compatible with deterministic mathematics. In a following essay on limited free will versus the illusion of determinism, I'll explain why macroscopic objects can be so well described with deterministic mathematics, as well as describing the fundamental difference between classical and quantum mechanics. Okay. Anticipated objection 3. Of course, things like electrons aren't conscious. This is nothing but an intellectual prejudice, a commitment to thinking in one way because you have always thought that way. It is also, on reflection, a very foolish prejudice. There is no logical reason whatsoever to rule out the possibility that consciousness is fundamental to our universe and that basic particles are conscious. In fact, given that you are conscious and you have evolved out of and are made out of nothing except these basic particles, then these particles being conscious is the most natural, logical, and economical solution to the question, how am I conscious? Historically, humans have assumed that what we call inanimate matter is not conscious because human understanding of consciousness can inevitably only ever be achieved through human consciousness itself. Thus, when some conscious entity doesn't exhibit any of the behaviors humans consider essential to their own experience of consciousness, such as movement, for example, they then tend to deny the existence of any consciousness at all. The main empirical fact that has generated this way of thinking is the difference between live human bodies and dead human bodies. When a human dies, all the special conscious behaviors and abilities defining human consciousness come to an end. Humans, therefore, assume all consciousness has come to an end, and that the inanimate matter of a dead body, as well as all inanimate matter, is devoid of consciousness. Of course, as we have shown, this can't logically be the case. And a dead body is conscious. It is composed out of nothing but conscious energy and matter. It is just capable of a very different and much reduced set of conscious perceptions and abilities than a living human body. Human conscious states depend on the various flows of energy and matter that define human life, such as blood flow, oxygen flow, and brain activity, etc. When these vital processes stop, there is a drastic change in the nature of the conscious states experienced within the body. After the vital processes have come to an end, the consciousness of a human body reduces to become like that of inanimate matter. The fact that what we call inanimate matter is conscious is probably the most startling consequence of my theory. In coming to terms with it, it is important to reflect upon how varied your own experience of consciousness is, as well as how inevitably mysterious is the exact nature of any consciousness apart from your own. It is important to remember that though things like electrons are conscious, their consciousness is very different to human consciousness. And of course, they have no reflective sense of self or personality. just some basic conscious perception, sensation of their local universe, and the conscious ability to choose from limited sets of future states to instantiate. The consciousness of something as simple as an electron is inevitably going to be extremely basic compared to human consciousness, involving only some basic bare perception without any reflection or ego. You have undoubtedly experienced such basic states of consciousness yourself. For example, when you get lost staring out of a window. In this case, your consciousness can sometimes reduce to nothing but the bare conscious awareness of your visual field. You are capable of just simply seeing, without any accompanying reflection or judgment on what you are seeing or any accompanying emotions or thoughts. Just bare perception devoid of ego. People who meditate try to regularly achieve such states. States of bare perception like this are likely how things as basic as electrons always exist, just perceiving and acting without reflection or forethought or ego, and always experiencing nothing but their present moment. Obviously, they don't have memories or the ability to reflect like humans do, because we know that that requires the hardware of something like the human brain, which has taken billions of years to evolve. Then, something like a chair, for example, is an object made of a very large number of these basic conscious entities, bound together in very regular arrangements called crystal lattices. These arrangements don't possess the complexity of a human or animal brain, and are therefore devoid of most of the complex range of conscious perceptions and abilities that a complex brain is capable of. A chair is conscious in the sense that all the particles and atoms it's made out of are conscious, and are consciously deciding all the quantum choices that are entailed in the physics of being a chair, that until now we thought were being decided probabilistically. And thus you don't have to worry about hurting a chair's feelings any more than you did when you thought all the quantum decisions involved in its existence were being made probabilistically. Fundamental consciousness is the only way to make logical sense out of your conscious experience. You can put your conscious attention into any part of your body, your foot for example, and you can share in its conscious experience. This wouldn't be possible if all the stuff your foot is made out of was non-conscious. What you feel is a communication of the consciousness your foot is always experiencing. Nerve fibers are embedded in your foot and share in its conscious experience. When you put your attention there, the nerve fibers transmit a conscious sensation of your foot's consciousness to your brain, within which you experience a conscious neuronal impression or transposition of your foot's consciousness. If the particles and atoms of your foot weren't conscious, you wouldn't be able to share in their conscious perception the way you regularly do. I will expand on these ideas in a following essay on conscious physiology. Fin.